Tech Tuesday webinars are brought to you by CJW Consulting and Services, Incorporated, providing software and technology-related training, consulting, and services to nonprofit organizations, and by our presenters, who offer their expertise to you freely through these webinars. Please consider contacting our presenters whenever you are looking for consulting services. Nonprofit Webinars is brought to you by For Good, a next-generation collaboration community for nonprofit and social impact professionals. Connect with the people, webinars, and resources that you need to make an impact. And now I'll turn it over to our presenter, Jay Love, co-founder of Bloomerang. Take it away, Jay.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate that, and welcome to all of you that are out there from across the country. We certainly appreciate you spending an hour with us to find out today. One of the first things I always talk about is asking in a rhetorical manner, do you know your current donor retention rate if you're involved in fundraising at your organization? In all of our surveys, less than 45% of the fundraisers happen to know their current retention rate. And we find that it's really hard to have an impact on something if you don't know where it exactly is residing at the present time. So that's part of where we go with that, and figuring out why retention is important. A small change in that retention rate, once you know what it is, can make a big change in the lifetime dollars raised from your database of donors that you have for your organization. In fact, a change of 10% can actually make a change of up to 150 to 200% in the lifetime dollars raised. And we'll dig into that number a little bit and show you the meanings and where that comes from so you can get a little bit better understanding. Now, one of the ways I've found that really bringing this to life of how important retention is, and this is a slide I've shared with many nonprofits that they tell me really sort of is a bit unsettling to some of their board members. Let's take a look here. On the left-hand side, you can see the number of donors that this organization has. If they start with 1,000 donors, and I'm going to draw your attention to the bottom row where the attrition rate is 60%. That's right around the national average. Look what happens each year. At the end of year one, you go from 1,000 to 400 donors. Year two, 160. Year three, 64. Then 26. After 5 short years, that 1,000 donors, if you are at that 60% attrition, which is a 40% retention rate, you've dropped down to just 10 donors remaining in your database. Now, what this causes most organizations to be involved with is what I call they're on the acquisition treadmill, which means that they are spending most of their efforts on trying to find and acquire new donors rather than retaining the old. And you can see the difference there. If you can change that attrition rate and move it up, you can have quite a few of those donors remaining with you for 3, 4, 5 years or longer. And we'll show how that plays out over a longer period of time here in just a minute. One of the ways of bringing this data to life is to look at actual data taken from small and medium-sized nonprofits across the country. And the data that we're going to be using was pulled together from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project. I have the great pleasure of being involved with this project at its very outset about 8 years ago, when one of the executives at the Urban Institute contacted me and said, Jay, do you think there's a way that we can pull together the data from all of the fundraising software vendors so that we can see in summary what is happening year to year with regards to engagement, retention, and et cetera for that? They combined their efforts a few years later with the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and it's really allowed this fundraising project or the FEP to come to life. This is the various vendors that banded together to share their data. So those of you out there, if you're using one of these software vendors, you would see that some of the data that we're about to share here may be coming from your own database there. So the data from the results from that show that in the most recent year, in 2013, the results, that the retention rate was 39% versus an attrition rate of 61%. The hard part to believe about this is that really means that 6 out of every 10 donors do not give again the next year. And that's what we're going to be focusing in on some ways that we can help that with technology and with social media to make that change. So what has happened over the years, if you look on the right-hand side here, that has dropped from a 50% level down to the 41%, and then most recently down to 39%. So it has dropped literally more than 10% in just that time period. But look at the difference between two different categories here. In that group of thousands of nonprofits that contributed the data, the new donor retention rate was 22.9%, but the repeat donor rate was almost 3 times that of nearly 61%. So one of the key things we'll be talking about are the ways that you help move people from making their first gift to your organization to making that second gift and beyond, because once they become a repeat donor, you have an average retention rate of nearly 61%, and there's some organizations that average retention rate for the second year donors and up is above 80%. So it is quite significant to what that can mean to your funding. So addressing the retention problem. I'm often asked, well, how do we go about that? And I think the first thing is to understand that the retention problem really is a donor relationship issue. And it all stems from how we build relationships with the donors on how good of a cause we have in keeping them in the fold and keeping that retention rate up. I involved 2 of the best-known industry experts as pulling together some of the solutions to this problem. On the right-hand side, you see is Dr. Adrian Sargeant. We have the good pleasure here at Bloomerang of working very closely with Dr. Sargeant, who's one of the 10 most influential people in fundraising, who's done 22 years of research on donor retention, donor engagement, and etc. And then on the left-hand side is Mr. Tom Ahern, who's considered to be one of the premier coaches for donor communications and experts on how do you communicate with donors to get your message across more effectively and to nurture them in the way that builds relationships like we see coming about to make the success rates higher and higher. So it was actually Dr. Sargeant who coined the phrase, improving donor retention rates by 10% can increase the lifetime value by 150 to 200%. And when Dr. Sargeant first said that to me, I said to myself and asked him, you know, can you prove that to me in some sort of a statistical manner? And he said, well, first of all, you got to understand the actual retention rates for that and where they come from. So for those of you that may not be aware of how you figure the retention rate, it's a very basic mathematical formula with a numerator and a denominator. The bottom denominator is the number of donors in the previous 12 months, and then the numerator is comprised of those same donors, what portion of them gave again in the next year. So let's use an easy math example. If you had 1,000 donors in 2012 and 450 of them gave again in 2013, you would have 450 over 1,000 or a retention rate of 45%. So pulling that together and being able to have that at your fingertips makes such a difference on knowing whether or not the processes and procedures you put in place are helping with that or not. Here is the mathematical chart that Dr. Sargeant shared with me, and you can see if someone moves the retention rate from 41% up to 51%, what a change that can make to the results here. As you can see in the first year, the second year there, but the first additional year, you raised $451,000 on the left side, but $110,000 more, $561 on the right. You have that same $100,000 difference for the next couple of years. Overall, the group on the left raises out of a 5,000 donor database $820,000. On the right, almost $1.3 million. So it's a difference of over $450,000 by just a 10% change in the retention rate. Now, many of you may be thinking, well, that's not a 150 to 200% difference. Well, the additional factor that really moves that percentage up much, much higher is based upon the number of donors that are there for 2, 3, and 4 years that serve as referral people or stewards in bringing in additional donors. Your best stewardship is usually done by people that have been involved with your organization for 3 years or longer, and as you can see, the more donors you retain, the more chance for stewardship you have to take place, and each new donor starts a chart of their own. And so if you've got a particular donor that has helped bring in 10 additional donors. That would be 10 more on a chart out to the right or the left there. And as you bring all those charts and additional spreadsheets into mind there, that's where we can take those numbers up to the 150 to 200% level. So let's define lifetime value. That's very simply the total net contribution that a donor generates during his or her lifetime in your database. And this can be a very strategic item for you and your senior leadership, and maybe even for your board to consider, because most board members have no idea for the nonprofit they serve on what the average gift amount is and the average amount of time that a donor is with their organization. From all of the FEP data that I was sharing a little bit earlier, we know that the average amount of time that a donor donates to a small and medium-sized charity in the United States is 1.9 years. And the average gift is somewhere in the $120 to $130 range in that time period. So your organization, if you can figure out those variables, you can quickly define what your lifetime value is for any individual in your database. So let's talk a little bit about how we can have an effect on those retention numbers. And what I got listed here are 6 very key retention drivers. One of the first items that Dr. Sargent's research points to is drip feeding your mission performance data. And what we're talking about there is sharing the effect that your mission is having on its chosen audience. And the very best way to do that is via stories that bring your mission to life. You can do some charts and graphs, but I think stories about how individuals' lives have been touched or how your mission is coming to life is so much more important. One of the other key aspects is to connect often. In fact, for the brand new donor, that first-time donor, it's very important to connect more than one time in that first 90 days. In fact, one of the suggested metrics is to see if you can connect with somebody 3 times in the first 90 days after they make their initial gift to you. And we'll talk a little about a communication plan that can make that come to life. Third, be quite personal. If you can segment via your database and personalize every interaction that you have in some way, shape, or form, that allows the relationship to be built in a stronger manner. And speaking of relationships, we want to develop it like a good personal friendship. So combine various communication methods. So if you have someone that a gift was made by the mail, you might try reaching out to them by telephone or by a handwritten thank you letter as well as your normal thank you letter, and see if there's multiple methods you can use to try to build that personal relationship. One of the more hidden ones that I think can be very powerful is to try to use any human connectors that are involved. So if you have, for instance, a special event and someone has invited people to sit at their table or to sponsor them or to be part of their golf foursome or whatever the case may be, use the person that invited the other people to send a thank you letter or to do one of the outreaches that occurs in that first 90 days. They will relate very, very closely to the person that invited them to be part of that, and you don't see that happen very often. I get involved and invited to a lot of peer-to-peer fundraising activities, and very seldom do I have interaction after the event with the person that invited me to be a sponsor to do that. And then last but not least, always communicate what the funds are being used for. It's very important, particularly with younger and middle-aged donors, to let them know what the projects are that they're funding and how those are coming to life. Some engagement factors that can come into play that you want to track to see how engaged someone is within your database are some of the factors that you see here. Trying to see if you can keep track of the recency and pattern of their giving, whether or not they give outright or whether they're a recurring gift donor or they have a multi-year pledge, the number of years of continuous giving, whether or not they're upgrading or downgrading, whether or not they attend your events or volunteer that you see over on the right-hand side. If you're using a commercial email engine, trying to keep track of who opens those emails, who forwards them on to friends, who clicks through to links in it, those factors can also tell you how engaged a person is, as well as whether or not you have inbound interactions, as you can see over on the right-hand side. And then are they involving other people through stewardship and through soft credits? Are they inviting other people to participate? Each of these factors gives you a clue of how engaged somebody is and how strong you're building that relationship and how so much of it can come to life for you as you move forward. So let's think a minute about why people leave their giving to an organization, and think about some of the factors that come in play here. 5% of them thought that the charity did not need them anymore. And as I go through some of these, think about the impact of communications on this here. 8%, they had no information on how the monies were being used. 9% of them, no memory of ever supporting. 13% never got thanked for donating. 16% that they left, there was a death involved there. 18% poor service or communication. 36% felt that others were more deserving, and the largest one by far, which we may not be able to have much of an impact on, could no longer afford. There was 54% there. So it really, when you look at these items together here, we start to see why the retention rates are only at that 39 or 40% level, as we see so many of these factors coming into play. So one of the ways that you can bring this to life is to focus in on the donor communications. And I'm going to use some of the examples from Mr. Tom Ahern here. And I love his quote here: "Are your charity's fundraising, advocacy, and other persuasion communications riddled with the common hidden flaws that limit their effectiveness?" And we see this quite often. We're going to talk about some of the typical hidden flaws that can come into play that can have an impact on your ability to retain donors from year to year for that. One of the Tom's secret for success, and if you can think about this as someone is reading not only an appeal letter, but think about it as it applies to acknowledgement or thank you letters. You're trying for mental nods so that someone finds your message the type that as they're reading it, they're nodding their head yes, that they're in agreement with you. Another key secret to success, and we're going to expound on this in a few moments here, is making sure your appeal is not about how wonderful your organization is, but your appeal is about how wonderful the donor or the supporter is, that we're giving them the praise and the recognition for making your mission come to life. And one that I see violated quite often is for any type of letter or communications going out, make sure that the first paragraph is 10 words or less. And people may be asking, why is that the case? It's because most people skim documents before they decide if they want to go ahead and read them. And you want to make sure that you grab their attention and draw them on into the balance of your story by the first paragraph being 10 words or less. Now, another test that you can do is what we refer to here at Bloomerang as the Ahern audit. But this is an audit that you can do yourself for any written communications getting ready to go out the door. First of all, if you're using Microsoft Word or something like Bloomerang, you can do what's called the Flesch-Kincaid reading level test. And that's basically scanning the document and seeing if it's written at the 6th, 7th, or 8th grade reading level. The most effective nonprofit communications are written at 6th, 7th, and 8th grade level. Anything below that is sort of an insult to the intelligence. Anything above that is not able to be skimmed or scanned by the reader. So we find that to be the most effective. Now, many of you may be thinking, well, my last appeal letter I sent out to a committee, and then by the time the committee revised it, it became a much higher reading level. Well, that is often the case, and why Tom and myself and others always recommend that the appeal letter be written from one person to the next. So if you're in charge of fundraising for your organization, make sure you write the letter and leave it as if it was you talking to somebody. It does not have to be absolutely perfect to be an appeal letter or a thank you letter. Now, the top one there is what Tom refers to as the U test. And this is where you basically go through and circle all of the pronouns in your communications and see how many of the pronouns focus in on the donor or the person receiving the letter versus you as the person signing the letter or the organization. Many times we tend to write about ourselves or our organization, and we forget to be focused in on the donor there. And it's very simple. By counting the pronouns, the yous versus the we's, we can see if you have at least a 2-to-1 ratio. And that 2-to-1 ratio means that you've passed the U test and you are there. If you don't have a 2-to-1 ratio, you'll see something like this popping up that's red. Or if the reading level is different here, as you can see, the reading level was at a 5th grade level rather than 6th, 7th, or 8th. So it caught both of those to make those come to life for you. So let's talk a little bit about a game plan here for your acknowledgments or your thank yous. One of the easiest ways to do that is a little 4-quadrant segmentation that we see here. And we're dividing this into, on the left-hand side, people that are new donors, and then on the right side, repeat donors. And then the upper ones are people that make gifts that are above your average gift level, and then those that are below the average gift level. And I share this because oftentimes I'll go back to brand new customers that I've helped put database systems in. And sometimes I remember one customer that I went back and visited several years later. They were still using the same single thank you letter to thank and acknowledge every single gift, and they had not changed it. So some people had received the same letter for 2 or 3 years in a row, but more importantly, there was no differentiation whether you were a first-time donor, a repeat donor, whether you were a high-level donor or a low-level donor. It was the same letter with the same PS and et cetera through that. And one of the ways you can make these 4 quadrants come to life is to think about a communication plan for each one of these segments so you can design and see. And part of the communication plan might be some individualized contact. For instance, if you have a brand new donor that has come in above your average gift level, that might be one that you want to pick up the phone and call and thank personally, or to see if you can pay a visit to thank personally. And you can see perhaps for the repeat donor that's below the average gift, maybe you would want a different PS or a handwritten PS that goes on that letter to see if we could prompt a different action the next time around. But each one of these can make a big difference and an impact by having this segmentation come to life by as simple as these 4 quadrants. Some of the communication plan rules that you can bring into life, I call them acknowledgement principles, but here are some of the ways that you can build into those communication plans that make them much more effective. Number 1, 48-hour rule, that any gift that comes in should be thanked within 48 hours with no exceptions for that. I know that some organizations really struggle with that, but I really am a true believer that most folks expect to see that back to them. And if you do it in 48 hours, that means it may be back to them in a week, depending on where the mailing is going out to. Next, be different than the rest. And one of the best ways to figure this out is to actually do a little shopping yourself. One of the things that I've always done with my new employees at my tech companies over the years is to give each new employee $100 and ask them to make 20 $5 gifts and see what happens, see what the communications come back like, how the organizations treat that. And that little test can give you your own little home shopping guide to be able to see what are the most effective communication techniques and routines that other organizations use. The third point there is one that I should be putting a big asterisk beside. Handwritten communications last forever for many individuals. If you can send out a handwritten note, most people truly cherish those because they are the exception rather than the rule, and people will keep those notes with them and have them handy, and you can have your information about their impact on your mission and what your mission means to the your community and all in a note that they keep with them, because some people will keep these for years and years and years. The next one we alluded to a little bit earlier, but state exactly what the monies will fund and how that's being used. And one of the easiest ways to do that, even in a general end of the year direct mail appeal, is to have a specific project or two that you're going to route the monies to for that particular mailing. and then tying into the handwritten rule above, calling or seeing in person as often as possible. If you really want to help guarantee a higher retention from the above average donors, is to make sure you bring this personal contact into the picture for that. Think about it. If someone takes the time to pick up the phone and call you, or pay a visit to you, or share a meal with you, the chances of you being a longtime supporter with that organization have increased exponentially. So those factors can really make a huge difference in making that come to life. Another set of communication best practices that you can tie into that is, as I mentioned, sit down with your team and map out a communication track for each segment. Now, we looked at one for thank you letters. Maybe you want to come up with a series of multiple segments for any appeal letter and decide how we're going to treat each one of those differently. One of the ways that you can have a touch point in the first 90 days is to do a very brief or quick survey. And when I refer to brief or quick, we're talking about just 2 or 3 questions that give people a chance to tell you how they would like to be communicated with, how often, and perhaps where their big interest in your mission lies. But it's very important, if you do the survey, is to honor what the requests are and make sure that you adhere to what their answers were to you in the survey. As we talked about earlier, involve the human connectors. Anytime you can use people that introduce them to your organization, the chances of success and retention move up much, much higher because of that. Keep everything as personal as possible, because the personal side of things means that it means nurturing to them for it. And then one thing that I urge you all to never forget is the U-test for every contact you have with somebody, not just in your written communications. Think about it. If you're having a personal conversation with somebody, if you are talking with someone on the phone or meeting them at a restaurant, it's so much more important for that individual for you to be talking about what's important to them and why they're making a difference and how they're special to your organization. So think about that, because I've had meetings with fundraisers and they were talking about how neat and how special the organization was, but they didn't really put the credit back to the donors for funding that. And that type of sharing of information is just music to the donors' ears. So let's talk a little bit about social media and how this comes into play, because this is one important aspect these days of the communication that comes into play for somebody. The goal of social media is to build a community, as you can see listed there, and your followers are your online supporters. And we are nurturing and fostering them just like every other person in the database. Not everybody in your database will be a social media follower, so you've got to be aware that these people react and respond in a different manner than perhaps a direct mail constituent that you might have. So keep in mind that each social media network has a slightly different community. Your Twitter followers expect different things than your Facebook followers, just like comparing them to your direct mail or your email newsletter list. They are different creatures, and so let's dig in a little bit and see how those differences can come to life for you. First of all, don't be bashful about integrating the social media into your overall fundraising efforts for that. If they came to you via social media, you can actually do your gift acknowledgement and say thank you in some manner via the social media. This is particularly important as it applies to volunteers. So many of the times volunteer recruiting takes place through social media, so why not do the thank you there via that same mechanism? And I think people that have congregated around certain social media channels really do appreciate those thank yous coming there. Obviously, it's a tremendous tool for promoting events. And when you make the promotions come alive there, you have the chance for it to cascade or to grow and exponentially be shared with other followers that each of your followers have. Don't be bashful about following back and interacting with your supporters. It needs to come across as genuine interaction, though. not as marketing oriented or salesy in any way. Just true interaction where you answer questions, you share thoughts, you offer advice, you work with them on a person-to-person basis, but via the social media. And then you can, when we talk about stating how the funds were used, that really becomes fun in social media. Many times you can use a video or the recipients of your mission work and be able to share that or say thank you based upon that. So a lot of really neat examples that you can see of social media where success stories come to life and are shared among hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of followers. So acknowledgement here. As you can see here, we've got a video that comes into play here. Someone saying thanks here. We appreciate that. And here is a thank you serenade just for you as part of that. So, depending on what your following is, folks can very, very much appreciate that. Here's another example where we've got a picture stating 1,000 words. And this is for Texas Humane Heroes, where we've got adoption heroes. And we see the actual recipients of your mission come to life here for you. And like you said, this picture means so much more than a chart or a graph could ever mean to those individuals that were supporting your organization. One of the things that you want to be aware of that is now becoming more of the norm for databases is whatever database that you're using, being able to track the handles for the more popular social media outlets there. So being able to have the Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and any other more popular social media ones, it's important that you have that in your database so you have the ability to communicate through that mechanism as well as the more traditional mail and email mechanism. So if you've got that in the database and you can keep it there, one of the nice things about having that information, they don't become as stale as mailing addresses and email addresses do. Those tend to be kept alive and in full use by the people that are active in each of those social media outlets. So it's also a way of staying in touch with somebody that may be moving or changing their email addresses quite a bit. Don't forget that you can, if you've got events and that are taking place, social media is a wonderful channel for getting that information out and sharing and helping with the event registration. You can see here that we've got someone that's putting a Twitter message out about an upcoming event and probably has a few links in it that you can go out to and actually register for the event. The interaction that you have there, and that's where you get to know your followers and get a chance to see if they're making comments about the work of your organization or their volunteer efforts. It gives you a chance to thank them almost in like you were doing it in person. As you can see here, that the folks at Joy's House are communicating with one of their followers and thanking them for stopping by and being involved with their mission work. So it does require someone to actively be monitoring and working with those social media channels, but when you do, the results can be very, very powerful. So let's talk about a few of the basic rules for social media for that. I love to refer to it as the rule of thirds for that. 1/3 of your time is spent with your content, 1/3 is with other people's content, and 1/3 is with interaction and conversation. So it's not like traditional marketing channels. You've only got a small part of it is where you're putting content out there. The other 2/3 are other people's content and then people talking and relating and interacting about that content. So keep that in mind because it's a different mechanism than some folks have been used to. Now, tracking and measuring your efforts, there are a lot of free tools out there. If you're active on Facebook, there's something called Facebook Page Insights. If you're on YouTube, obviously there's YouTube Analytics that give you a glimpse into what's happening with your YouTube channels. If you're using Google to track the action and activity coming to and from your website, Google Analytics offers all sorts of insights, and you'll be amazed at perhaps how many people are coming to your website from social media tools. So it's a good way of figuring that out. There's a tool for Twitter called FollowerWonk, and you can make sure that you're tracking a lot of the activity there. And then there's something called Social Crawlytics that combines various avenues of the social media and helps that to come to life for you by the use of that tool. A couple of the more affordable paid tools that you might find interesting that can help with your efforts. One is called Crowd Booster, and the other one is called Viral Heat. And they'll go, in some cases, a step or two beyond the free tools that you have there and help you grow that social media network that you're searching for. Some other ways that I think gives you some ideas of how to best interact and to use social media to your advantage. Here are some of the very best newsletters and blogs that we find that provide up-to-minute content. Most of these have content that's daily updated, if not more so. One is the HubSpot newsletter that you can see in the blog that you have. Next is Moz.com. They have a wonderful blog that talks a lot about making your website much, much more powerful. Social Media Examiner. There is a blog called Kissmetrics that talks a lot about it. And then our own Boomerang blog that our team puts together here that has quite a bit of content that changes on a daily basis. And what's nice about this, it's blending a lot of technical tools in with good, sound fundraising advice that you can find to be a very practical usage. As you look through and you look at these resources, I'll sort of leave you with these tidbits and comments that will help social media come to life for you. It's something that there has to be daily activity if at all possible with. Your followers will know if you're only checking in once a week or once every other day. Something can become stale if it's not reacted to in a certain amount of time. Offering up new content is vital for that. And then as you offer that content, if people engage with you and have a discussion, make sure that you are reciprocating and adding to that engagement and that conversation yourself and helping that to come to life at all points. So, Joe, let's see if we've got a few questions that have come in from our group there that might be pertinent to talk about as we relate back to some of the social media tools and, of course, all of the retention and ideas and principles that we were talking about in regards to donor engagement. So any questions that have come in, Joe, so far?
Hey, Jay. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing any questions right now. I chatted to everyone just to remind them to type in their questions. Look, we just got one that came in. Jennifer asks.
Okay. Usually one question spurs many others.
Yeah. What category would the donors who donate 1 year and then skip the following year, but donate again the next year? Has there been a study done on why those people come back?
Okay. Well, there are many reasons why people come back. Sometimes they were asked to come back. Perhaps a particular communication caught their eye that did not happen in the previous year. Sometimes the human connector comes into play, and you've got someone that invited a group of people to attend one of your events, and then they tried a different group of people the next year, and then the following year they went back to some of the original folks that attended before, and sometimes the attendance at that event is what brings the donation to life for that particular year. So those folks, unfortunately, can move the retention rate down because they're not donating in contiguous years with you for us. But it's a good thing not to ever forget about those individuals, because those lapsed donors that can come back from that, so we refer to the people that gave in some year but not the most recent year. There's a whole direct mail strategy for trying to appeal to those. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you've found that you've tried to get those previous donors to come back 2 or 3 years in a row and they really haven't come back, then you might have to sort of let loose of them and not waste your communication dollars and time going after those if you've had 2 or 3 years go by without them. In fact, um, one of the consultants I've had the good pleasure of working with often talks about one of the best things to do is to divide your database of names into three groups. Those people that have provided 0% of your funding in the last 2 years, those people that have provided 10% of your funding, and those that have provided 90% of your funding. And do very little with the 0% if it's been 2 years or longer. For the ones that are 10%, try to figure out if there's some way that you can do automatic communications and still keep them involved. And then the 90%, the people that provide 90% of your funding, if you can focus most of your time and effort onto that, the results can be startling because that can cause the amount of dollars being raised to actually double or triple in later years.
Wonderful. Catherine is asking you to repeat the lifetime giving value statistics that you cited regarding how long an average donor gives.
Okay. From the FEP statistics, the average donor gives to a nonprofit for 1.9 years. So that is so the least anybody could be is a 1 year, because that means that they were a donor at all. And the people that give to you 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 10 and 20 years, that's what moves the average up to the 1.9. So in the most recent set of statistics, the average amount of time that someone stays with your organization is just under 2 years. The average dollar amount will vary based on the organization, but as you heard me say, it's just a tick over $100 is the average gift amount.
Great. Julia asks, when you talk about donor retention, are you only talking about individual donors, or are you including foundations, churches, and organizations? Also, do you include corporate sponsors for fundraisers?
Yes, it includes foundations, corporations, etc. For that, and it's important because if you look at the dollar retention, not just the donor retention, but the amount of dollars that come back from 1 year to the next, losing a significant corporate sponsor or a significant foundation grant can really impact the dollar retention much more than it does the donor retention. But yes, those gifts and transactions are factored into those percentages there. So, like I said, it's even more startling that when you count in those foundations and corporations, that still more than 6 out of 10 of those groups that donated in the previous year did not come back the next year.
Great. Jennifer asks, if you're going to buy acquisition lists, what kinds of list buys are most responsive to social cultivation?
Well, those would be lists that were coming from areas of social networking already. For that, I'm not aware of a good source for those. Unfortunately, I wish I could provide that to you and see. The most of the success I've heard about is where people have grown their social media list of folks that are connected to them in an organic fashion. It's hard to really add to that with a significant influx there for that without having it be the sharing and the growing of that via your own followers and members that you have already. Those are your best avenue for attracting new people into the social media network versus an outright acquisition method like we sometimes see in the direct mail world.
Great. Mary asks, when you thank your committee members for their help for getting attendance to an event, would you ask them separately to reach out to those they invited?
Absolutely. At least the first time. If they've had people that have come time after time, that's not as necessary. But just think about it. If you yourself are asked to attend an event by a dear friend, you're doing it because of the relationship with the friend. But we want to transfer that relationship from not only the friend, but if it's your friend saying why the mission of this particular organization, of this nonprofit, is near and dear to their heart, there's a very good chance that that passion for your mission can be transferred if that person shares that themselves, much like a personal testimonial can make such a huge difference there. So if it's a possibility that they could send a thank you email, or that they would not mind drafting the letter, or maybe even adding a PS to a letter, it can make such an impact on that first time donor and helping them make sure that they come back. Because think about it, anytime that someone's a first-time donor, you've got that first 90-day period to make an impact and say to them, my gift made a difference. I am special to that organization, and it's important for me to come back and support them in later time periods.
Great. Roxanne asks, what are your thoughts on direct mail campaigns, especially if an organization has not started one?
It's a good way of seeing if part of your constituency likes that mechanism for communication. Depending on how those names came to you that you have, one of the easiest ways to see if they would like to be communicated with via mailings of one nature or another is a brief survey. And that survey is one way that you can do it is by mail, or you can do it by telephone, you can do it by email. It depends on what type of communication method you have available to you, and what sort of information you have on that particular person. But you can really try and see if someone has responded to that, because the nice thing about it, if someone is a previous donor to your organization and has responded to direct mail, you can get response rates of 40 to 60% if it's going back to repeat individuals. Now, don't be, and I'll give a caution, if this is your first time doing direct mail, realize that acquisition direct mail, where you're trying to get people to donate for the first time, can have response rates of less than 1%. That means 99 people out of 100 you send a letter to, you will probably not hear from. So be aware that the odds in that area, in that arena, are a bit stacked against you.
Right. So Paula asks, I send a monthly constant contact out to my email list with pictures and stories about our kids once a month. Should I send an update more frequently?
I think once a month is probably a good ideal area there. I wouldn't do it in the same manner. If you wanted to try to get a little bit more frequent, you might try creating something called an action alert. And the neat thing about an action alert is anytime you have something that's very newsworthy, or something that's affected your mission or something like that, you can send out a very, very short email in the form of an alert. It's also, that translates very nicely to sending it out to people via the social media. You can post that same little action item as a Twitter post, as a Facebook post, as a LinkedIn post. So that lends itself very nicely there, rather than trying to turn your monthly item into something that you send out every other week for that. Because if people are used to getting it in that pattern, that's probably producing the best results you can get right now. And then you can say, separate it and say, I've got this new mechanism called an action alert or something else that might fill the bill there.
Great. I think we have time for maybe two more questions. Kristen.
Okay, that sounds good, Joe.
Okay. So, Kristen asks, what are some ways to invite your donors to follow you on Twitter without coming across pushy?
Okay. Well, the easiest way is to start by following them. If you can follow them and occasionally interact with them as they are making posts on Twitter, the chances of them following back to you are increased exponentially for that. And that's really not pushy in any way, shape, or form to do that. And if you follow them and you do a couple responses or a couple interactions and they don't end up following you, I would leave it at that and not try to push it beyond that standpoint, because 9 out of 10 people that, if you do those 2 or 3 items, they will become followers of yours.
Right. So Linda says, our nonprofit hasn't been very active yet with Twitter, given how time-consuming our work with Facebook and LinkedIn is. And she wants to know how essential is it to engage with our community fully through Twitter.
It may not be essential at all. It sounds like you've got a pretty good program going with the Facebook and the LinkedIn uh, for that. So uh, I would experiment with that and see if you are attracting different groups or if it's just the same people that you're interacting with in the other two social media networks. If you feel like you're picking up additional followers that you haven't touched in other manners, then I would continue doing that. But that's a nice project that you might undertake with a collegiate summer intern or someone that's working on a part-time basis, and then judge it after a certain time period to see if you're seeing any significant additions based upon those efforts.
Great. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. Just want to thank
well,
you.
if there's anybody that has any additional questions that they might want to ask, my email address is on there. It's j.love@bloomerang.co. So if they would like that, do we provide a copy of the slides for them too, Joe? Is there a way that they can get their hands on that information?
We do. The slides will be up on For Good as well as the recording of the webinar.
Oh, outstanding. Okay, good.
Right. So I just want to thank you, Jay, for presenting with us today, and thank everyone for attending. Just want to remind everyone to sign up on For Good to stay in the know of our webinars and everything that's going on For Good. We would appreciate it if you would complete the evaluation that will pop up as soon as you leave the webinar. And just another reminder, tomorrow we have the case for integrated planning, and next Tuesday, advanced annual reports. Jay, would you like a last word?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for that and all the wealth of good questions that we had there for you. We enjoy sharing that, and I hope we can have an impact upon your retention and your use of social media as you're building the followers and the network of individuals that will support your organization going forward.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jay. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
So long.